Welcome to the Science for the Public lecture series. Science for the Public is an organization committed to bringing science information and issues to the general public. Visit our website for our program listings and blog. Good evening, I'm Yvonne Stapp. Welcome to Science for the Public. And tonight our guest is Professor Suzanne Freedberg. Suzanne Freedberg is a professor of geography at Dartmouth College, New Hampshire. This year she's Burkhardt Fellow at Radcliffe Institute for the Advanced Study here in Cambridge. Dr. Freedberg received her BA in anthropology from Yale University and her PhD in geography from the University of California at Berkeley. Her research spans the fields of agro-food studies and cultural economy and science and technology studies. Her first book, French Beans and Food Scares, Culture and Commerce in an Anxious Age, is a comparative ethnography of two post-colonial fresh produce trades linking Africa and Europe. Her second book, Fresh, A Perishable History, examines how the meaning of freshness in food has changed along with the technologies designed to protect it. At Radcliffe, Professor Freedberg is working on issues surrounding the sustainability of food and agriculture. Today's food market is a global one. What we eat comes from everywhere. The business of growing, processing, transporting, and storing that food has environmental consequences, the most familiar one being the carbon footprint. But big food producers and retailers, in order to present an image of responsibility to consumers, now want to measure much more than carbon. But what exactly is food's footprint and how is it calculated and who decides? Dr. Freedberg answers these questions for us this evening, telling us about the experts behind the green labels and what all this footprinting might mean for our food and our planet. Dr. Freedberg, welcome.
Thank you.
Okay, and she's going to give us a whole lot of information tonight, but could you start, please, with refreshing our memories? What is a carbon footprint?
Well, the carbon footprint just refers to it sounds like a geographic reference, but there's a spatial measure, but it's actually what I call it, sort of a biographic measure, in that it refers to the cradle-to-grave greenhouse gas emissions associated with any product, including a food product. So in the case of the carbon footprint of a hamburger, you would need to include all the greenhouse gas emissions that go into producing the beef, including the fertilizer, including the feed, including the processing, the transport, and then in the case of the hamburger, the greenhouse gas emissions associated with frying up the burger, and then any emissions associated with disposal. And if you're including the whole hamburger bun, then you would need to include the greenhouse gas emissions associated with baking the bun, and so on and so forth for the ketchup as well. So it's a very comprehensive measure, at least as far as greenhouse gases go.
Okay, so that's the carbon footprint there. And you've gone a lot farther in this respect. And so you talked, and I saw a talk recently by you about this life cycle assessment, which most of us don't know anything about. Can you explain what this is for us and how it all came about?
Okay. Well, life cycle assessment itself is not a new field. I don't know if you remember, maybe back in the early 1990s, this debate about diapers. Mm-hmm. Was disposable versus reusable diapers. And this was a debate that actually has gone on for years and years, but it was based on life cycle assessment studies. So it's similar, the carbon footprint is like a simplified form of life cycle assessment, or LCA as I'll call it. And it just means that you're measuring the entire cradle to grave environmental sort of existence of a material good. But the difference between the carbon footprinting and doing a full LCA is that experts in LCA attempt to measure all kinds of environmental impacts. So yes, greenhouse gas emissions, but they're also looking at pollution. They're also looking at water pollution. They're looking, in some cases, at the water footprint. They're looking at ozone depletion. They're looking at natural resource depletion. So kind of the whole environmental shebang.
Okay. Is this fairly new, the LCA part, or?
Not really. I mean, the first LCA, according to the field's own sort of history, was back when was conducted by Coca-Cola back in 1969, when Coca-Cola was trying. At that time, it was using all recyclable glass bottles, and it was trying to decide at the time whether it could make an environmental case for switching to another kind of packaging, in the case, aluminum or plastic, for example. So it isn't new, but partly because it's actually very complicated, it's for many years has sort of languished in obscurity with nobody paying much attention to it.
And now, why are they paying attention to it, and who?
Well, it has a lot to do with the carbon footprint initially. Yeah. I mean, if you may recall back in 2006, 2007, this was when Al Gore's Inconvenient Truth came out, and if we start talking just about food, this was 2007 was the year locavore was the word of the year, and so this was a time when people were really starting to think about the climate consequences of what we eat, and it's sort of been common, it's sort of an easy assumption that well, the farther away the food comes from, then the worse it must be for the climate. And I can actually show you some slides.
Thank you.
Okay, so it's okay. I'm just going to be skipping through some of these. Okay. These are some articles from the early 2000s, and this was actually what got me interested in the carbon footprint. Was that some supermarkets in the UK, Tesco and Marks and Spencer, in response to British consumers' concern about climate change, introduced these airplane labels on all their air freight produce, much of which, if it's going into the UK, comes from Africa. And this was fairly controversial because, well, for a couple of reasons. One is that African countries have contributed almost nothing to climate change. They're, in general, very low carbon. And secondly, the airplane label wasn't based on anything very scientific. It just was assumed that if food is flown in, it must be bad for the environment. And Kenyan exporters actually responded to these airplane labels with their own campaign called Grown Under the Sun. And what they argued was that, well, if you look at the whole carbon footprint of our products, because they're grown under the sun as opposed to in greenhouses like much of the produce in Europe, at least at certain times of the year, it's actually overall greener than the European alternatives. So this was this all happened back right around in 2007, and so big businesses started to think, well, really, in order to have a sort of scientific case for what we sell and so forth, we really need to start measuring the entire carbon footprint. So here are some examples, and so some supermarkets started to put things directly on the labels. There were French supermarkets started putting things, the carbon emissions of your entire purchase on the receipts. There was the Japanese government started putting carbon CO2 emissions on a number of products, including beer. So this is what really got me interested in the carbon footprint. But then I thought, well, what is a carbon? I started to ask myself, well, what is a carbon footprint and who's measuring it? And that's how I discovered that the real experts in this are the people who are doing life cycle assessment.
And you knew a lot, you learned a lot about these experts, right? So what is it that they do? What do they measure? How do they measure? You end up with these kinds of labels, and you have mentioned what kind of specialties they represent. Can you tell us about that?
Well, they are, I mean, we say measuring is actually not really the right term,
word.
because they don't actually measure. They tend to be engineers. They rely on data, and so they model impacts rather than actually measuring them. And they sort of comb databases of all kinds all over the world, often using very sort of rough estimates. Like in the biggest databases are all European, and particularly Swiss, which. So you can find, so there actually isn't any data on Kenyan green beans. So they have to sort of estimate using maybe data on European green beans. So in many ways, as a geographer, as a field scientist, to me it looks very sort of approximate. But they can come up, they can crunch a lot of numbers, and they can measure, they can estimate a lot of different things. But they tend to come out of fields like environmental and chemical engineering. And what they're doing is looking basically at all the material and energy flows that go into a product's life, and all the different kinds of environmental emissions that come out of a product's life.
Right. May I ask, when you got into this, it was like another whole level, evidently.
Yeah.
Was it very difficult to sort of penetrate this data collecting?
Yeah, well, as a social scientist, it was I actually took a course in life cycle assessment at the Harvard Extension School, and I learned the software, and I had to do my own life cycle assessment as part of the homework. But then I spent a lot of time actually sort of traveling around to interview these experts, to sort of learn how they think.
Yes. How do they think? Do they think?
Yeah, they think very hard.
They
think it's very much, they sort of think in flowcharts, and it's even the ones who specialize in agriculture, for example. They don't typically go onto farms, which is like a lot of my past research has been going to talk to farmers, and
right.
So they're looking at agricultural databases rather than farms per se.
Agricultural databases, is that like
production?
Like
the food and agriculture, the FAO.
Okay, all right. So in a sense, it's what they collect is at the end of the line. It comes from somebody else.
Yeah.
In a sense, it's secondary,
Yes.
not primary. You had gone out and looked at actual fields, and did you perceive that as very different, as unsettling or anything, or it's just once you learned how to do it, you could?
I mean, it is. It raises certain questions about the accuracy of the numbers they come up for, especially because LCA was originally kind of developed for industrial products, like Coke bottles or something. Yeah. And for most of the sort of field's history, they've measured industrial products. But when you're talking about agricultural products, you're talking about things that are produced under immensely varied conditions,
right.
Much more varied than factories, so that you may see quite a bit of variation in the soil and greenhouse gas emissions, and so just from one field to the next.
Right. Just as an aside, when I think of that, this is a huge scale, for example, and as you say, there are these tremendous variables right there when you're looking at agricultural data. The temperatures one year, the weather, all of these things factor into the availability of water, relative availability of water, and so on. Do they adjust for this, or did you find that straightforward, no problem?
Well, you can, but the thing is that doing an LCA, a full life cycle assessment of a product, is actually to to do it well is very time consuming and can be very expensive. It can take, you know, if sort of an expert consultancy is doing, it can take several weeks to several months, tens of thousands of dollars to do a single product.
Right. Who pays for such a thing? Who uses that? Right. I mean, is it going to show up in my mailbox or anything like that?
No. I mean, this is an important reason why, for so many years, it didn't get a lot of airplay.
No.
And it wasn't being. I mean, it was more. There are more companies, more governments are paying attention to life cycle assessments in Northern Europe than in the U.S. But these days, increasingly, it's major retailers and manufacturers, and even since 2007, when I started paying attention to the carbon footprint, more and more companies have come around and said, well, actually, we need to measure more than carbon. We need to measure as many things as possible in order to show that we are sustainable, you know, concerned about sustainability. So the biggest example of this is a flow chart of a ketchup LCA.
This is just the ketchup.
Yeah, that's just the ketchup. So the biggest patron of life cycle assessment these days is Walmart, which back in 2009, as part of what's become known as its green revolution, announced that it was going to create this vast sort of sustainable product index in which all the products on its shelf would be sort of ranked according to sort of the things that life cycle assessment measures. So carbon footprint, water footprint, natural resources, and so forth. And in 2009, when it made this announcement, it implied that all this information was going to be provided to consumers. It was going to show up in a single, you know, sort of easy-to-read format for consumers. It's now not so clear that that's going to happen. But in order to build this index, Walmart emphasized that it couldn't do this alone because it was going to need data from its suppliers, and there's some 60,000 suppliers in the world for Walmart. And so, partly in order to do this, it formed what's called the Sustainability Consortium, which is a consortium. It's technically a research initiative. It's based in the University of Arkansas, but it's funded entirely by corporate membership fees, which run up to $250,000 a year. And it's not just for food, but there are a lot of food companies involved, which range from, or food related anyway. So you've got Coke and McDonald's, you've got Kellogg's, you've got Mars, you've got Monsanto, as well as some of the other agrochemical companies. And all these and you've also got a handful of large NGOs like the World Wildlife Fund, the Environmental Defense Fund. And so all these organizations are supposedly committed to this larger project of doing life cycle assessment on all kinds of products and using this information both to inform consumers, perhaps, but also in their own decisions of how to make things and what to put on their shelves.
Do you have any sense of how that actually determines what shows up on their shelves? Like, has it had any change? Have you seen any change?
So far there's no evidence that and partly the problem is that, in fact, they haven't figured out how to basically speed up everything. So the first 2 years of the Sustainability Consortium's existence, despite the fact that they would have recruited some of the top LCA experts in the world, all of whom I interviewed, in the first 2 years they finished studies of 7 products.
Right.
So things like Wheaties and yogurt,
Yeah.
and not laptop computers or something.
Exactly. So, and the other part of this that interests me, at least, is that these are, for the most part, very large corporations. They're not Ben and Jerry's or something like that. Is that the consortium difficult to get into for companies that maybe really have a commitment, but they can't get their names on this? Is that a possibility?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. I mean,
All
there
right.
are. I think Stonyfield is on there. So
Okay.
Stonyfield, but again, it's paying. It's
Right.
paying. And I think
it's a lot of money.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Where does this money go? It goes to the experts, or?
Yeah, well, it's going supposedly into research, but
That's
there's
what I
actually
mean,
quite a
yeah.
bare bones staff that's doing that at the University of Arkansas. So, that's a good question of exactly where all the money is going. It's not
that's a lot of money. Yeah.
I mean, it's a bit ironic because the whole project is supposedly devoted to transparency, generating all this information that is going to help companies
7
and
products.
Yeah, but it is.
Right.
It isn't. Yeah. It hasn't been the easiest organization to find out about.
Okay, so one of the difficulties, we have 2 things then. Most of us don't really know a lot about what's involved in that LCA, and I promise you, if you look, say, Wikipedia or something like that, it is really obscure. You can't understand what this thing is. So one of my questions for you was like, what are the measures? But I can appreciate that must be a really difficult thing. The other thing is, how does this affect the products at the end of the line? Let's say that we have something that is that makes an enormous carbon footprint. Could that be one of those 7 products that somebody might say, well, let's do something about it? Does anything happen necessarily as a result?
Would this be a good time to show the?
Yes.
Okay, so I have a Walmart video. It's called "The Secret Life of Sliced Turkey."
Hidden behind the labels of the products on our shelves lies a vast system of companies, each of which has ingeniously evolved its industry to grow, manufacture, and deliver the products of our lives. The raw truth is that the design of this system is unsustainable. We are running out of the resources we depend upon to survive and thrive. This reality presents an unprecedented opportunity, an opportunity that can only be seen when we step out of our individual roles and view the system as a whole. Join us as we explore the secret life of sliced turkey.
A lot of people think that the turkey they eat starts at the farm, gets processed, and is delivered to the store. That's really just the tip of the iceberg. The whole story involves much, much more. From an ingredients point of view, this one product is comprised of many products. Each ingredient, from salt to sweetener to the zipper on the package, is a separate, distinct product. And each one of these products has a life of its own. So we tracked each one of these products back through the system, from our supplier to their suppliers to their suppliers. And because each dot on this map represents a factory or facility that uses resources, we began partnering with those suppliers to get information about energy use and water use.
For this pound of turkey, we are finding that the processing of the turkey itself consumes the highest amount of water. Farbest, the processor, went to work on innovating their water use in their facility. They discovered a way to process more turkey while using nearly 50 million less gallons of water a year. In terms of energy use, we can also see that the manufacturing of the sliced turkey product has the highest costs. In just 2 years of viewing their business through the lens of sustainability, Plumrose's new trucks are up to 30% more efficient, and they found ways to deliver more product while driving 800,000 less miles doing it. That's 300 less coast-to-coast hauls a year. Rethinking distribution led to redesigning packaging. Today, they're selling more turkey but using 35% less cardboard, and by converting to reusable crates and pallets, they're leaving more trees in the forest and conserving water for millions of families in the surrounding communities. In total, these innovations are saving Plumrose nearly $1 million a year.
Seeing our business and our products in this way is a real game changer. It's helping us grow our partnership with Walmart, it's showing us who the real leaders are in the industry and our supply chain, and it's helping us reduce cost. And perhaps more importantly, it's helping us make connections all the way back to the farm, where we know a lot of innovation opportunities exist. Partnership is very important, otherwise we're just an island, and we need to be more than that. I mean, we need to be connected. And when we get more and more cooperation from our suppliers and their suppliers, there's no telling where we're gonna go.
In the end, all this effort is about the customer in the store. It's about saving her money and making every dollar she spends a vote for a better world.
Okay, well, that was impressive in the sense of this was very well motivated, that in fact there were some significant changes in costs and stuff. You still get that horrible processed turkey at the end, and they're still living under those conditions. But in any case, it sounds as though putting all this, once you figure out the rubrics, how to do this properly, you could save resources and money and all sorts of things. You worked your way through this. Did you feel that that was the case, and or is it sporadic, or?
Well, I mean, the one reason why it's important that this is a Walmart video is because Walmart, I mean, this goes well beyond, this is not greenwashing. Walmart has the clout to make many big companies change their ways.
Yes.
And Walmart does have an interest in any kind of sort of eco-efficiency that's going to save money. So reducing water use, reducing energy use, reducing cardboard boxes or something, that's all good, right?
Right.
Good for Walmart, and in general, sort of good for the environment. But it also, I mean, it can be very seductive, these sorts of things.
It's meant to be.
Yes, and it doesn't, you know, this is what was focused on here was not actually a complete life cycle assessment. It wasn't looking at, you know, toxicity, you know, what might have been the pollution caused by the turkey farm, for example. Yeah. So there are things that the guy starts off by saying, "Oh, this is not, you know, the whole story. But now we're going to tell you the whole story." Yeah. It's still not the whole story.
Right. I understand that, and that the whole story is just gigantic, especially when you think about all the pieces that go into any kind of a product. That piece of turkey and stuff. That's understandable. I understand that. Can we live without an LCA at this point, do you think? It sounds to me that companies need it, that it really can add up to a savings somehow. It's that factor I understand. In terms of quality of product, I'm asking, do you think we can do without the LCA, or do we need it more? Do you think?
Well, I think that, I mean, the general idea, the broader approach of life cycle thinking, this is what the LCA experts talk about, is life cycle thinking is valuable, and it's something that, you know, even as a geography professor, and I encourage my students to think about where things come from, who else has handled them, and things. So that's hard to argue with that big picture perspective. But I think that a lot of attention goes towards towards these claims about, well, we've got the whole story, and now this means we are
doing a really good job.
That we are now a green company, and so forth.
Right. And you're not, maybe that's not always too persuasive,
well,
or
again,
something, and it could be in a process.
Yeah.
Right, in process. What does it mean for a consumer? Does it, I mean, at the end of the day, and I'm of course pushing toward your superb article that I wanted to ask people to be sure to see in the HuffPost thing, but at the end of the day, what does it do for consumers? Does it help us? Can we understand what they put on the back of these packages? Because it's incomplete in various ways. What do we get out of this?
Well, how much sort of information on the package we will get is sort of less and less clear. So I mentioned that back in 2009, Walmart had said this was all going to be for the consumer. But anytime you put something that's what they on a label, or what they call consumer-facing information, then it has to be pretty precise. You have to worry because then consumers can start saying, well, should I buy this turkey or that turkey?
Right.
And then companies can argue with each other. And this was the problem with the diapers long ago, is that they were arguing about each other's numbers. And this is why it took them 2 years to do those 7 products. And so companies, since even just over the past couple of years, if you read the trade press, there seems to be a sort of rethinking in the world of corporate food. It's like, well, maybe, especially given that we already know that maybe 5% of consumers are actually paying attention to green labeling anyway. And I'm talking, organic is one thing, but organic tends to be something we pay attention to for health reasons as opposed to environmental reasons. But the percentage of consumers who are really paying close attention to green labeling is very, very small. So therefore, companies are thinking, well, is it really worth all this time and effort? And wouldn't it be just more useful, wouldn't we get sort of more bang for our buck if we just focus on, they call sort of B2B, business-to-business communication. And then we don't have to worry about being quite so precise. So what seems to be happening now inside the Sustainability Consortium is that they are not worrying so much about precision, and they're just, the researchers there, again, as far as I've been able to tell, have been just focusing on getting sort of a rough idea, like in the case of the banana, what are all the different kinds of environmental impacts that we should be worried about for bananas? So that when Walmart sits down with its banana suppliers, it can ask them, so what have you been doing about water? What have you been doing about pesticides, greenhouse gas emissions, and so forth? And so then Walmart can sort of get Dole or Chiquita or whoever to make changes. But none of that information is necessarily going to show up in a number on the shelf.
Right. How about accessibility to that information, though, if you are one of that tiny percent? And then I want to ask why people are not engaged in it. Why is it that they don't know this stuff? Is it a case of, maybe I should start there, is it a case that they don't know because you don't know that information is out there? Do you see what I mean? Or are they disengaged?
Well, I think, to answer the first question first, I don't see a lot of evidence that it will be accessible, that you will be able to find out exactly how Walmart decides which bananas are greener than others. And that's one of the troubling things about it, is that it's the Sustainability Consortium that's going to decide what questions get asked of suppliers. But in terms of why don't consumers pay attention, we're busy,
True, but you mentioned just shortly ago that in Northern Europe, for example, people pay attention to a lot of this stuff. In pockets in this country, people pay more attention. When that whole locavore thing started, wherever that might lead, it was like people are waking up to this. So there may be a curiosity, but you don't know what to look for. Right,
yeah.
Right. It's like that label. It says it's organic. It must be, right? So the question then is, well, if the information is available to the consortium, and they're rather slow getting it together, but that may be just a process thing, just something that for the time being. But people might want to know, they don't want to read 4 volumes, but they might want to know. And so are you optimistic? Do you think people will be more?
Well, the big test case right now is France.
Yes.
Which I
would you tell us about that?
Yeah. So,
please?
and this is again something that's gotten remarkably little
yes.
press coverage in the U.S.
Yes.
But the same year that Walmart, within a month of Walmart announcing its index back in 2009, France passed a law saying, and it was the first country in the world to do so, saying consumers had the right to complete, accurate, and detailed environmental information about their products and their food in particular. And they passed this law without realizing quite how complicated this was going to be to put into place. So it took them about 2 years to sort of come up with the guidelines for companies. Right now it's in a trial period, and this is the launch of the trial period back in October. So there's 160 some companies that are involved in producing this information, and it's called, they're referring to it as eco-labeling, but a lot of the information is actually just going on companies' websites. So they have, some of them have developed like, pages you can access versus your smartphone. And these are some examples of the labels. The interesting thing is that right now, and this, if it becomes a mandatory and universal, they'll have to change this. But right now, companies they're all doing different kinds of labels.
Yes.
So some have numbers, some have sort of spectrums, some have letter grades. And here you have examples of wine and eclairs and smoked trout and all kinds of nice things. But you can't. But because all the companies have done it differently, you can't actually. French consumers can't actually compare. But this trial is supposed to go on for a year, and then the government is going to do all kinds of surveys and research to find out, can consumers, well, first, can they even figure it out?
Yes.
Does this, water footprint, does that make any sense to them? Does eutrophication, some of them are measuring water eutrophication, can they get that? And then 2, if they can get it, are they actually buying any differently?
Yes, and that takes time, I guess, to assess that
Yes.
sort of thing. But there's one country out there that at least makes an effort, and you can appreciate that the whole thing takes time while people figure out what is the best thing. In your mind, are the French consumers interested in that sort of thing, or does it just put them to sleep?
Well, my anecdotal research, I was there in October, and I went into some stores and interviewed some shoppers, and most of them had not noticed it yet.
Right.
And then and people that I talked to at greater length would say, "Well, this is all very nice, but I buy for taste." So the French government sees this as kind of a long-term, like a generational project, that it may take 20 years before consumers sort of understand, sort of think about the carbon footprint the way they might think about calories or something.
Yes.
Not that French
Right.
think about calories that much, but it is. I mean, if the government decides to go forward with it and make it mandatory, the EU is watching this. Japan and South Korea have also indicated they're looking at the France example. And it could become, if it becomes mandatory, it will apply to all products sold in France. So it actually has big implications for international trade and for U.S. companies. So it's not a trivial thing, but a lot depends on how consumers react to it.
And consumers need to know something and probably are interested in some part of this, and maybe will become more interested in the future. But you wrote a wonderful article about this, and so I want to make sure that people know about it, and you can just click on it in the on our website. But can you please tell us about that? Because you're talking about going beyond, in that case, I think it was Going Beyond Food Inc., if you've seen that film. Could you give us a little? Yeah,
well, this was an op-ed that I wrote in response to Food Inc., which I think also came out in 2009. And I was a little bit incensed afterwards because on one hand it's a movie that shows all kinds of major problems in the food system, structural problems, problems of power inequalities, of lack of transparency, of power, lobbies that are influencing government policy and so forth, and then the movie part ends and the credits start to roll and says, well, you can, but you can do something, you can change the world, with every bite or something. And the op-ed that I wrote was called, Vote Now, Eat Later or something, because I think that I think that we can't change the world with every bite, and we can't. The most important changes are not going to happen solely through our market purchases. And I'm as loyal a farmer's market shopper as the next person, but I don't think that just buying the right thing is enough to, for example, to get rid of the agribusiness lobby that's responsible for a lot of the problems in the U.S. food system, for example.
Okay, so because you're stuck with buying a lot of the foods, or you may not know, or not everybody would know, but you made such an excellent point in there. I happen to see Food Inc. twice myself, but it's very interesting to hear your excellent analysis there that that's not enough. Just what you eat or don't eat is not solving a larger problem. And so what does solve the larger problem?
Well, the problem is that the larger problems take harder work and more frustrating work, right? Yeah, I think we have to remember that we're not just consumers, but we're also citizens.
Right. Okay.
And so in the U.S., one of the big projects, and there are now lots of groups working on this, is reforming the Farm Bill, so that subsidies are not going to these major commodity producers, so that so there are food supplies, and I don't want the Farm Bill would not solve everything, right, but it would. Right. I think that the Farm Bill is kind of an artifact of the sort of the huge power inequalities that in the U.S. food system, okay, and a food system that's really dominated by the interests of major corporations. Okay. Not even, we talk about the subsidies going to farmers. The farmers are in general not the main beneficiaries. Right. It's the corporations.
Exactly. Do you know if that situation obtains in other very developed countries? Yes. As well? The same thing?
Well,
basically.
It's very similar. I mean, we romanticize the French
exactly,
system,
or the Swiss or something like that, but it's not really what's going on. Is that it?
Yeah.
So this is
not it's not a uniquely U.S. problem. It's just but because the U.S. is big and is a major agricultural producer, the scale of, I mean, the problem with the U.S. food system is the harms are not just to us as U.S. consumers, but they're global. Because we produce so much surplus, we end up dumping a lot of it on, in poor countries.
Unsuspecting
yes, yeah.
nations, yes, right,
yeah.
Right. But it also has produced a great deal of waste, and I was just wondering if that is the stuff that is not the perfect tomato gets chucked or something like this. This very different approach to what counts as perfect and so on, and you get a lot of stuff just chucked out, and so that I don't know if that factors into this assessment at all too, but it is huge. But your point, I think, was that, well, citizens have to wake up. You have to be a citizen, not just getting out your selected munchies there, but to actually act as a citizen. Do you have any other good points for us, the advice for us that you'd like to add, or anything else that you'd like to show before I let people ask questions there?
I guess I would say not to agonize too much about every purchase. I mean, in terms of how to minimize your own the environmental footprint of your own diet. A lot of the things we've known since the 1970s. About eating lower on the food chain, and not eating things that are greenhouse grown in the winter time and so forth. So, but beyond that, I would say that because your purchase is not going to change the world, that it's not worth too much mental energy, I would say, and it's better to devote that to other kinds of work.
Right, and then maybe it takes more of a collective approach, like the Consortium, something that is the counterbalance. That, right, okay. Dr. Friedberg, thank you so very much, and I need to let the good people ask you questions at this time. And so first, thank you very much. And then I'll turn it over to our audience. Since the sound will not pick up well from the floor, if people ask as clearly as you can, and would you mind repeating it? I will try to write it down as well as I can too.
Okay.
Okay? Thank you, please.
I was wondering if one of Belmont's citizens, Frances Moore LePay, influenced you with her groundbreaking book, Diet for a Small Planet. What was that, in the 1970s?
Yeah.
Yes, it was.
About the impact of animal-based diets versus plant-based diets. And just, to me, she seemed like such a visionary, and that message still seems to be as relevant, if not more, than ever before. So I was just wondering if she influenced you at all.
Yeah, it's funny you should ask that, because, probably my life would have been very different if I read my mother's copy when I was a teenager. I decided on the basis of that to become a vegetarian, and have been so ever since. But then I also, but I'm not a proselytizer, just that happens to be. But then after college, I went to work for her, actually, as a volunteer, which she was then living in San Francisco, and that was when she was at Food First. So Food First was my first, it was actually a volunteer job after college, and it was from there that I discovered the geography department at Berkeley, where they do a lot of research on food and agriculture. And so actually, yes, it was pivotal. And I saw her, I was on a panel with the Boston Book Festival with her last fall, which was we hadn't seen each other for years and years. But
sounded like your mother had a good book collection.
Absolutely the right thing, and she is right here. So and has just come out with something new, or her daughter has.
That's why we were.
The new book. That's wonderful. We're glad to know. Please.
Yes.
I have two questions. First, I imagine the LCA is the result is essentially a lot of quantitative data about the impacts of the product.
Yeah, so the question is, like, how can you use LCA to actually create an index? And that's one thing that they're trying to figure out at the consortium, because one problem is that often products that are good that score well in one sense may not score well in another. So, for example, many life cycle assessments of organic products, they will look very good on, they have very low toxicity, right, because they're not using synthetic pesticides, but they tend to have a higher carbon footprint because you need more land for the same amount of yield. So that's how do you weight these things? That's again, it's a political issue, and it's not, if you're just doing sort of individual studies, a company internally, it doesn't really matter. But if you're trying to create this vast index for all products, then it's much trickier.
Okay. Yes, go ahead.
I'm going to show my ignorance, but that's not.
That's all right.
At the very end, two of the just sort of throwaway things that people, obviously grown out in the field. I wouldn't know how to know that.
Yeah, there is no labeling for the greenhouse. I mean, sometimes you can sort of surmise. Like, so for example, I don't know if you've for example, one Shaw's carries this brand of called Backyard Tomatoes. I don't know if you've seen these recently. They're called Backyard Tomatoes, and the little subtitles, grown not too far from here. And so the Backyard Tomatoes is a company based in Maine, and I think that their greenhouses are the biggest built structures in the entire state of Maine. They're fairly new. There was a New York Times article on this last year or something. So if you're seeing those tomatoes in January, they're actually pretty tasty. I've tried them, but that it's fair bet that they've come out of a greenhouse.
And so that is, like, in terms of the LCA, that is worse than buying a tomato from a foreign place that's, you know, flown in, or?
It probably, if it's a tomato, it would probably be trucked. So in the winter, I mean, again, these aren't necessarily going to be very tasty tomatoes, but and I usually forego them in the winter. But in the winter, you would probably be better get a smaller carbon footprint of getting a tomato that had been trucked from Florida than one from Maine.
From Maine, especially. Eddie?
This is not a question, but I think the local produce place that has the best language is Russo's over Watertown, because they give us sorts of almost everything we sell. Somewhere on the car.
Yeah, it does usually say.
Yeah, some stores, you mentioned Russo's in Watertown, some stores are better than others, but they still won't necessarily tell you if it's whether it's greenhouse grown or field, you know.
That's true.
I mean, by law now, and this has been the case for a few years, supermarkets are supposed to put at least country of origin on all products, but I don't think that law is enforced very carefully.
Okay. One more, and then we'll stop, but then you can keep talking to us.
This is the cynic in me, maybe, but as long as these LCA analyses are being funded by the long list of corporations on your screen, is there any likelihood at all that the results will be used to make the kind of choices between products or between types of foods, as opposed to just making the product this company's already making a little more efficient?
Well, so the question is, is there, if LCAs are being funded by major multinationals, is there ever going to be any chance to make the kind of changes beyond what's profitable for Walmart and so forth? And again, I would say that France may be the test case, because this is supposed to be a public decision, and besides the government surveys and so forth, I think they'll be seeking public input. But I don't see the corporations coming up with any measures of improvement that would not benefit their bottom line.
It reminds me of when, I'm in the supermarket. I remember once spending 5 minutes deciding which bag of potato chips was less bad for me than the other.
Yeah.
I obviously shouldn't have been buying potato chips.
Shouldn't have been buying potato chips. Naughty, yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
People, we have to stop there for recording purposes. Please, as soon as we stop, then you can continue your questions if you would like, and come and talk to Dr. Friedberg. Dr. Friedberg, thank you very much.
Ron.
Thank you.